We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Daled Amud Aleph Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 74a. On the previous summit, the Gemara is dealing with a case where a person is given money and he's supposed to use the money to buy wine for someone else. He says, if I don't do what I'm supposed to do, then I'll even pay from my own money in order to supply the wine. And Rav Ashi said in that case, it's considered to be an asmachta. There was no formal kinyan made on this arrangement. And when we have an asmachta is not kona, and therefore he's not responsible to provide the wine using his own money. And the Gemara asked a question from a Mishnah later on. The Mishnah later on is dealing with a similar case of a sharecropper. The sharecropper is also supposed to provide a certain amount, and he's supposed to work the field. And he says that if he does not work the field, then he's going to be responsible. And there the Mishnah says he is responsible. And so the Gemara answers that the difference is, in one case, it's biyado, but over here by the case of the wine, meaning by the case of the sharecropper, it's biyado, it's something that he can control, and therefore if he didn't do what he was supposed to do, he's responsible. But over here, lav biyado, when we're talking about the wine, it is not in his control, and that's why he is not responsible. Rashi explains, lav biyado, shema lo yimcharulo. The reason why it's not biyado is because maybe they won't sell him the wine. He doesn't have a guarantee that the sellers are actually going to sell him the wine, and therefore it's considered to be an asmachta. He's not responsible to provide the wine with his own money. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Hani beit lasa de yahavi zuze lechad lemizvan lehumidi. If you have three people and they give money to one person, and he's supposed to buy something for them. V'zavan lechad minai, when he buys it for one of them, so zavan lekulu. So then it's considered that he bought it for all of them. V'lo amranela de lo tsar v'chasim inish lechudei. Now that's only true if they don't give the money separately, meaning essentially in separate bundles. Avot tsar v'chasim inish lechudei. But if they give the money in separate bundles, so then Laman de Zavan, or Laman de Lo Zavan. For the one that he bought. For the one that he didn't buy, he did not buy. And Rashi says, De Lo Tsar v'chasim mos shall call ish v'ish levad, meaning each money is independent. If the money is all given independently, so then it's considered that he purchases for one person at a time. And the literal translation of Tsar v'chasim is that it's wrapped up and sealed. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Papi Mishmei de Rava. Rav Papi said in the name of Rava, Haisi tumta kanya. If you have a marker essentially labeling something, that's considered to be a kinyan. The Gemara says, Lamai Hilchasa, for what are we talking in terms of the kinyan? To what extent is it a kinyan? Rav Chaviva Amar Lemikni Amamish. Rav Chaviva said it means it's a full kinyan. If you label it, then it belongs to the buyer. Rabbanan Amri, the Rabbanan say, Lekibule ala mishapara. It doesn't mean to say that it's an actual kinyan. It just means to say that they should follow through with the transaction, and if they don't follow through, there's going to be a mishapara. That's again the curse of the mishapara. The Hilchasa and the halach is Lekibule ala mishapara. The halach is that it's really just to receive the curse of the mishapara, but it doesn't actually create a kinyan. However, if it's in a place where the minhag is that this is that the minhag is lemikne mamish, that the minhag is that this is an actual kinyan, so then kanus, and then it is an actual kinyan, we follow the local minhag. Rashi explains, Situmta chosem sharoshmin hachenvonim alachevios shal yayin. This was a chosem, it was a seal that they put. Essentially, the storekeepers would label the wine, shalochen harbe biyachan. In other words, a lot of wine would be bought at once. Umanichan osan ba'otzar abaylim. It would be placed in the warehouse of the owners. Umolichan osan achas limchor lechanos. And they would bring it one at a time to be sold in the store. V'roshmin osam ladas shakol reshumos nimkaros. And they essentially put some kind of a marking on it to show that all the ones that are marked, those are the ones that are sold. So the person, the buyer, is not actually doing a physical kinyan. He's not bringing it to his own reshus. Nevertheless, that label is going to serve as a kinyan. The Gemara initially said that the halach is that it serves as a kinyan as far as mishapar is concerned. However, uva asra lemikni. But if the local custom is that it's a full kinyan, then we treat it as a full kinyan. Sheregilan lirsham al menas shebedover zeh tehekenu yolo ki'ilu mashach kani. If the minhag over there was that they would mark it, and through the marking it's considered to be a kinyan as if a meshicha was done, then it is considered to be a full kinyan. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Hayahu techila lakotzrim. Let's say the seller was the first among the reapers, and he actually has the grain to sell. It's ready with him, so then he's allowed to set a price since he has it at the ready. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav says, Mechusar shtayim, if it's missing two actions, meaning to say you're still processing the grain, and you still need to do two things, so posek, you can still set a price at that point. It's considered like you have the items available. But shalosh, but if it's already missing three actions, so aino posek, then he can't set a price. It's not considered that it's readily available to him at that point if there's still three things to do in terms of the processing. Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel says, Bidei Adam, if the things that need to be done are in the control of people, so afilu meya posek. So even if it's missing 100 things, he can still set a price because it's in his control, therefore it's considered that he has the merchandise. But Bidei Shamayim, but let's say it's in the hands of heaven, meaning to say it's something that's out of his control, so afilu achas eino posek. Even if it's just missing one action, he's not allowed to set a price because it's not considered that he has the merchandise. if there's something out of his control to actually finish the processing of the merchandise. And the Gemara continues, Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Posek imo al hagodish, he's allowed to set a price for the stack of grain. Now the stack of grain is missing some processing. Number one, you're missing putting it into the sun to dry. Ulameidash, and you're also missing the threshing. Umidra, and you're also missing the winnowing. And the Gemara says to that, what happened was, he actually did throw it into the sun, he put it in the sun, and it did dry, and therefore he's only missing 2 items, not missing 3. But the Gemara says, but according to Shmuel, who says that if it's in the hands of heaven, so even missing 1 action is enough that you can't set a price. But here it's missing the winnowing, and that's bidei shamayim because it has to be a windy day, the wind has to blow in order for the winnowing to be effective. And the Gemara says that's not the case, because efsher b'nefavasa, it's possible to winnow using a sieve, you don't need to use the wind, and therefore it's considered to be bidei adam. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, V'al ha'avet shel anavim, you can have the same arrangement when it comes to the basket of grapes. And the Gemara says again, there are actions that are missing. V'hamechusar michmar, you're missing the warming of the grapes. V'yulei levei matzarta, then you have to bring the grapes to the wine press. Lameidash, you have to tread on the grapes. Ulamingad, and then you have to draw the wine out of the wine press. And the Gemara says, Kidatani Rabbi Chia, the answer is like Rabbi Chia taught, when it comes to olives, he understood it's al hakomer shel zaysim. It means to say it's the komer of the zaysim, which means that the olives were already warmed. And hachanami here also al hakomer shel anavim, we're talking about grapes that were already warmed, and therefore there are not 4 actions left, there's only 3. The Gemara says still, v'amechusrei telos, but aren't you missing 3 actions? And again, if it's missing 3 actions, it's not considered that you have the product. And the Gemara says to that, ba'asra, we're talking about in a location, the ahud zav and who the nugget, that it's the person who buys who's the one that draws it from the wine press, and therefore there are only 2 actions that are remaining. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, V'al amaton shel zeistim, the same arrangement is by a vat of olives, and the Gemara has essentially the same Gemara as above. V'hamachusar michmar, but we're missing the warming of the olives, v'yulei levei and bringing it to the olive press, lameidash, and then to press the olives, ulamingad, and to draw it out of the olive press. And the Gemara says again, Tani Rabbi Chia taught al komer shel zaysim, we're talking about a stack of olives that were already warmed, and so the Gemara says ha'ika tlos, but still there are 3 actions left. And again the Gemara answers bi'asra adu dezavin ahu mangid, we're in a place where the person who's buying, he's the one that draws it out of the press. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, V'ala beitzim shel yotzer, again the same arrangement when it comes to clumps of clay of the yotzer. And the Gemara says, Amai, again, why? We're missing several actions. V'amechusar lefufe, we're missing rolling it, v'yavushe, and drying it, iyuale le'atuna, bringing it into the kiln, into the oven, essentially, lemisraf, and then burning it, ulemepak, and then taking it out of the kiln. That's 5 actions that are still missing. And the Gemara answers, kagon de melafefa, v'yavishu, the cases that they were already rolled and dried. And so the Gemara still says, v'yika tlas, but we're still missing 3 actions. And the Gemara answers, be'asra du de zavin, hu de mapik. It's in a place where the person who buys, he's the one that takes it out of the kiln. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said you can make such an arrangement v'al hasid mishishkenu bekivshan, when it comes to plaster, once it is sunk in the kiln. And the Gemara says again, it's missing some actions. V'hamechusar mikla, it's missing burning. V'apuke, and then taking it out of the kiln. Umeidak, and grinding it. And the Gemara answers, bi'asra dahu dezav and ahu daik. So we're talking about in a location where the person who buys it, he's the one that grinds it. But the Gemara says, Shmuel, but what about according to Shmuel? Damar bidei adam afilu mea posek, who says that if the actions are done by a person, then even if there's 100 actions missing, you can set a price. So lamali mishishkenu bekivshan, why does the Mishnah have to say that it was sunk in the kiln? Even if it was not sunk in the kiln, that should be sufficient for Shmuel. And the Gemara says, Ema, you have to say according to Shmuel that the Mishnah means misha roi l'shako bekivshan. It means when it was fit. From the time that it was fit to sink it into the kiln, that would be sufficient. That's how Shmuel would interpret the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, V'ala beitzim shel yotzer, again you're setting the price on the clumps of clay of the potter. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabban, and the rabbis taught, Ein poskim al habeitzim shel yotzer ad sheyasu divrei Rabbi Meir. You're not allowed to set a price on the clumps of clay of the potter until they are fully formed. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Ba'med devar mamurim, when is this true? Ba'afar lavan, that's talking about with the white earth. Aval bi'afar shachar, but if you're talking about the black earth, kagon kfar chananya v'chavroseh, like what's found in kfar chananya and the areas around it, or kfar shichin v'chavroseh, or kfar shichin and the areas around it, poskin, so then you are allowed to set a price, afal pisha ein lazeh, because even if this person doesn't have it, yesh lazeh, another person does have it, meaning to say that it is readily available. And Rashi explains, Ba'med devarim amurim, when is this true? Meaning, shetzarech she'ei muchan biyada. What Rabbi Yossi is saying is, when does it have to be prepared in his possession? possession, because that's what Rabbi Meir said. Ad sheyasu, it has to be fully formed. And so Rabbi Yossi said, when is that true? That's true ba'afar love, and that's talking about the white earth, she'eno matzah, meaning to say it's not found, it's not readily available. Ukashayu machnisin oso, ein machnisin oso ela megubal va'asui beitzim. So then when they bring it in, they're going to bring it in essentially fully formed. Aval ba'afar shachar, when we're talking about the black dirt, shuhu matzah b'makoma, which is readily available, ein sarach she'e biyado, it doesn't have to be in his possession, shem ein lazeh yesh lazeh, because if this one doesn't have it, someone else will have it. It is readily available on the market. And the Gemara continues, Amemar yoiv zuze michi ma'ayli afra, Amemar only gave money once the dirt or the clay was actually brought in. Rashi explains, Michi ailai afra mishehichnes hamocher, the seller had to bring it in, vitzavar offer bebeso, he had to gather it into his house, v'offer shachar haya, this was talking about the black clay, that's what we're dealing with over here, and essentially he waited till it was brought into the house. And so the Gemara says, come on, well, who is he following? Ikar Rabbi Meir, if he was following Rabbi Meir, Hamar Achiyasu, he just says it has to be formed. It doesn't actually have to be brought into the house. And Ikar Rabbi Yossi, if he's following Rabbi Yossi, Hamar Afal Pishain Lazeh, Yesh Lazeh, he says even if it's not readily available to this seller, meaning it's not in the possession of the seller, but it's considered readily available because it's easy to get on the market. And the Gemara says, Liolam Ka Rabbi Yossi, really Amemar was following Rabbi Yossi. Ovi Asri da Amemar, but in the location of Amemar, Ashik Afra, the dirt, it was very expensive, it wasn't very commonly found, even the black clay. So Idama'ili Afra, so if you would bring it into his home, so then Sam Chadaite, so then he would rely on it, V'yoiv Lu'uzuze, and he would give money, V'lo, but if not, Lo Sam Chadaite, he wouldn't be able to rely on it. And Rashi explains, Ashik Afra Yokar was expensive, V'yenu Motza, it wasn't commonly found. And Rashi continues, Sam Chadaite, again, if it was brought into the house, so then you could rely on it, D'chol Echad, meaning each party was then relying on this transaction, V'hachozer Yekavel Mishapar, and if anybody would retract from the transaction, that would be a curse of the Mishapara. But Lo Sam Chadaite, if it wasn't brought into the house, then they weren't relying on this transaction actually going through. Dilma Lo Mishka Chafra, maybe they wouldn't be apple to find the clay. V'leka Mishapar, and there would be no Mishapar in that case. Shuat because the whole thing, they're not really relying on this going through. They understand that there's a doubt over here, and therefore there would be no mishapara in such a situation. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "Uposek imo al hazevel kol yemos hashana." He's allowed to set a price for the manure the entire year. That's always considered to be available. Now that was the opinion of the Chachamim and seemingly the Tanakama. They seem to be saying the exact same thing in contrast with Rabbi Yossi. And so the Gemara asks, "Chachamim hainu Tanakama?" Isn't the Chachamim, aren't they saying the same thing as the Tanakama? Amar Rava says, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Dalid Amud Beis.